Well, good evening. My name is Robert Klein. I am program director here at the Moffitt Center, and I'm really happy to have Morgan Shipley here tonight. This is our second attempt at having Morgan. I don't know if you registered the first time around, but he was supposed to be here late in the spring semester and was in a car accident on his way, and we had to postpone. And I'm sorry for the car accident. I'm sorry for what happened to that night, but I'm kind of happy that we're here tonight. I'm happy that you're here tonight, and I'm happy we get to enjoy this time together. So Morgan Shipley is the, I was going to cheat off my phone and then it died on me. He is the inaugural Folio Endowed Chair of Spirituality and Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Michigan State University. His research relates to understanding mystical and esoteric new religions, those that focus on spirituality as opposed to institutional religiosity. And I will say, last night, a group of us, I was meeting with our affiliate faculty group in the other room, and we had read one of your articles and had listened together to one of your talks, and we were discussing it together. And the conversation I finally had to cut off after about 2 hours and 15 minutes because it just kept going. And I will say they gave me questions for you. So I have a few questions. And for the rest of you, I anticipate that you will have questions as well. Those also watching on Zoom, you can enter your questions in either the chat or the Q&A, and those will be forwarded to me, and I will relay those to Professor Shipley. So I would invite you to be ready with those. After Morgan finishes his opening remarks here, he will create space for interaction, discussion, and questions from all of you. And then I have mine in my notebook from last night. I'm going to have others that are coming in online. And at some point, we'll have to kick you all out. But now it's time to welcome Morgan Shipley.
Good evening. This is on working. Everyone can hear me all right? Wonderful. Again, thank you so much. Thank you for coming out this evening. I'm an hour ahead where I'm at in Michigan, so I'm not quite tired yet, but I appreciate you all spending this evening with me. I do have 4 kids. We'll talk about them a little bit later, so really feel privileged to be here and glad that this worked out. I'm glad that you decided to spend this Thursday evening here with me. I have a tendency to talk a little fast. I'm going to try not to. But I encourage you all, if you feel like I'm going too fast, someone just tell me to slow down, and I'm happy to do that. I also have a tendency to ramble. I love to talk, I love to teach. So I actually wrote my talk tonight, at least the first half of it, and then I'll end. I was told I had about 40-ish minutes for my talk, so I'm also going to put on a timer, or I will not stay on this. All right, so I want to begin by thanking Bob Pine and the Moffitt Center for this gracious invitation. I really feel honored to be here. I hold an endowed chair position named after a Catholic priest, Father Jake Folio. I'm clearly not a Catholic priest, but this connection point of thinking about spirituality and faith and religion through the lens of a broad religious community is something that I take to heart. And I really feel honored that I've given this opportunity to share my work with you all. I also want to thank Jill Olson, who I think just stepped away, for coordinating all this. She's made this process seamless and a joy, and I'm just happy to be here. And a special shout out to my friend Zach Cruz. Zach is a member of the University of Wisconsin Green Bay's faculty. He put me in touch with Bob, and that's how we ultimately ended up here together. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my talk. So ask somebody what it means to be spiritual, and you're likely to hear a wide range of answers. The presence of God, a profound connection to nature, a morning meditation, the pursuit of self-awareness, and a host of practices that range from yoga to tarot. Ask what it means to be religious, particularly in Midwest America, and most people will mention some combination of belief or faith, often in a higher power or divine being, edifices such as ashrams, mosques, synagogues, churches, or ritual practices like prayer or fasting guided by agreed-upon doctrine. For some, as we will discuss, no separation exists between these concepts. To be spiritual is to be religious, and to be religious is to be spiritual. For a growing chorus of contemporary voices, however, spirituality and religion are seen as foundationally distinct, and that's what I'd like to explore with us tonight. So at first glance, These two realms, spirituality and religion, may seem inseparable. But when spirituality and religion are viewed individually in a clear and neutral light, to borrow from the work of Clifford Geertz, they point to fundamentally different ways humans seek meaning, purpose, and connection. Spirituality often emphasizes personal experience, growth, and a felt sense of the sacred, however one defines the sacred. That might be a higher power, maybe nature, it may just be our connection to one another. While religion, again, typically, not always, but typically, signifies a recognized system of belief that binds people together through shared practice. Understanding this distinction is more than an academic exercise. It is the key to exploring why, in today's world, so many people identify as spiritual but not religious, and how these evolving paths shape how we live, love, and care for one another. The distinction between religion and spirituality has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate across theology, sociology, cultural studies, and my own field of religious studies. While often interrelated and commonly used interchangeably, I think one of the greatest frustrations I experience in trying to study this are people who will simply kind of go between religion and spirituality as if they're always signifying the same exact thing. Religion, in its most classic formulations, and is generally positioned within contemporary Western culture. Again, I want to stress Western culture. We expand outward and think about what religion and spirituality mean, let's say in the context of Southeast Asia, or the context of Buddhist or Hindu culture. Religion and spirituality do denote different things. So it's important to understand, at least for me in my studies, I am really thinking about these questions in relation to the Western and primarily American experience. That's where my expertise is in. So while religion is typically understood in the Western culture as a system of institutionalized beliefs, practices, and sociality expressed through communal worship, doctrinal adherence, and ritual observance. It commonly denotes an expression of theistic devotion to a higher power and acceptance of supernatural groundings, such as belief in the afterlife or the creative role of God or gods. It is important to remember that out of the 8.2 billion people who call Earth home, 2.3 billion identify as Christian and 2 billion as Muslim. And those numbers are not necessarily accurate because there's not always great recording, let's say, of Muslims in non-Muslim majority countries, and sometimes countries that are Muslim majority count everyone as being Muslim. So those numbers are a little bit of an estimate, but that is about 54% of the world's population who accept belief in one God and organize themselves around divinely ordained teachings. I only bring this up as a way to illustrate that for every 2 people you were to meet, if you think about way of averages, one would, very likely, answer the question, what is religion, with an answer focused on belief, faith, community, and practices directed by a single deity, directed by God. Theologian John Calvin, for example, exemplifies this orientation, describing religion as, quote, the piety toward God, which is joined with the faith of the heart and the outward observance of the duties of godliness, end quote. Significantly, religious adherence, practice, and membership underpin sociological understandings of religion. These understandings stress the outcome and intention of religion, which find worldly expression by organizing people into local communities and societies designed, as Emil Durkheim argued, to prevent anomie or normlessness in defining the human condition and creating a world without agreed upon ethics and boundaries. Durkheim famously defined religion as, quote, a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, which unite into one single moral community called the church, all those who adhere to them. For Durkheim, religion is not merely a set of private beliefs, but a social mechanism that maintains moral cohesion and collective identity. It binds individuals to shared meanings, ensuring that the sacred functions both a personal compass and a societal glue. For Clifford Geertz, and I'm only picking Durkheim and Geertz here because they're kind of 2 of the classic theorists of religion. For Geertz, religion functioned primarily as a cultural system, providing symbols through which people, here I'm going to quote from Geertz, establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions within such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic, end quote. Geertz's interpretation situates religion within the fabric of meaning-making itself, emphasizing how belief operates less as dogma and more as a shared symbolic language initiated to create cultural norms that maintain social cohesion. Through this lens, religion becomes a cultural blueprint that both interprets the world and guides human conduct within it. For many scholars of religion, it is this last function that proves most significant. Regardless of theistic convictions or even the truth, if there's a God, religion consistently functions as a mechanism for the regulation of behavior, with religious doctrine serving as a primary source of and for moral authority. Within many traditions, this involves not only exhortations toward virtue and compassion, but also the invocation of moral sanctions, often framing terms of divine judgment or damnation for those who fall short in conduct or belief. The Torah, for example, identifies 613 commandments of God, covering moral, religious, civil, and religious obligations that guide Jewish belief, behavior, and community life. Spirituality, by contrast, has increasingly been articulated in both academic and cultural discourse as a broader, more individualized pursuit that addresses the essence of the human condition. It is important to recall that while the term spirituality has its roots or its origins within Christian etymology, one of the roots for the word spirituality is spiritus, meaning breath or breathing. Though commonly associated with the Christian notion of spirit, this root connects spirituality to vitality, to existence itself. When considered this way, spirituality clearly has to do with more than religious membership or faith. It represents a path undertaken to discover answers to the most pressing questions of human existence. It speaks to our deepest anxieties and needs, including the quest for belonging. It captures concerns for individual and collective well-being, which is my primary area of interest. It offers perspective in moments of crisis and helps individuals and communities face personal challenges and collective unrest. Most basically, then, to borrow from Roger Gottlieb, a central figure in the academic study of religion, with a particular focus on connection between spirituality and environmentalism, he writes, quote, "Spirituality is an understanding of how life should be lived and an attempt to live that way," end quote. Spirituality cultivates awareness of self and other. It propels us to not simply uncover an approach to living, but represents the effort to bring that approach to fruition through virtuous conduct. Distinctly, when identified as a way of navigating this world with others, spirituality finds itself bound to compassion and empathy, with ways of living that elevate justice, promote collective stewardship, and embrace what I call reciprocal responsibility. For this reason, within my work, I follow the guidance of Ursula King, who urges those studying spirituality to remember that due to the sheer number of definitions and applications of the term, quote, "It is perhaps more helpful to ask what spirituality does rather than what it is." And I'm currently writing a book right now, and in the first chapter of it, I lay out 63 different definitions of spirituality that I've found across different culture and religious settings, right? Those definitions are significant. They tell us something, right? But in the end, if we move away from definitional structures, they're all pointing to this idea of live, right? How do we live and how do we choose to live? This is especially significant when we consider the nature and rise of the spiritual but not religious. As the Pew Research Center recently observed, many Americans who identify as spiritual but not religious emphasize being connected with their true self, being open-minded, and being connected with something bigger than themselves, rather than regular religious observance or participation in religious communities, such as attending a church. Importantly, and as I'll discuss in more detail shortly, this finding should not be read as creating an absolute dichotomy between religion and spirituality, nor between theism and atheism. Instead, it is a privileging of spirituality understood and positioned outside of, but not necessarily antagonistically to, religion. Among those who identify as spiritual but not religious, you are as likely to encounter someone who expresses belief in God or something supernatural as you are to encounter an absolute atheist who positions spirituality as something entirely devoid of faith or belief. For the former group, their positioning of spirituality contains, advances, reflects, and reimagines religious notions and theological positionings. In other words, identifying as spiritual but not religious may reflect a pursuit of spirituality that is entirely separate from any theological framework. For instance, by someone who identifies as atheist or purely secular. Alternatively, it may express a view of religion as a belief system and set of practices that one no longer feels connected to, perceiving it as something that has lost its spirit, authenticity, intention, or efficacy. Among those who have left religious participation but still maintain a certain level of theology or belief, spirituality represents a continuing commitment to live by faith or to seek to actualize their belief. As one person who identifies as spiritual but not religious put in during a recent interview I conducted, they said the following. They said, "I follow Jesus, but I am not a Christian." Thus, in highlighting the emphasis among spiritual but not religious on connection to both one's sense of self and something beyond the self, Pew's findings and other findings about the spiritual but not religious resonate both with Paul Tillich's classic theological claim that the heart of the spiritual life lies in, quote, ultimate concern, which provides meaning and direction to all human life. But it also captures an important distinction identified by Buddhist monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh, who emphasizes that in order to understand the worldly effects of spirituality, we need to distinguish spirituality from institutionalized religion. As he writes in The Art of Living, spirituality is not religion. It is a path for us to generate happiness, understanding, and love. so we can live deeply each moment of our life, end quote. Thich Nhat Hanh's reminder that spirituality is about cultivating happiness, understanding, and love in each moment resonates with Ursula King's insight that spirituality is not static, but a dynamic, transformative experience expressed in diverse ways by those who identify as spiritual but not religious. As King writes, and this is a long quote, so bear with me, contemporary understandings of spirituality capture the dynamic, transformative quality of spirituality's lived experience, an experience linked to our bodies, to nature, to our relationships with others in society. It is an experience which seeks the fullness of life, a life of justice and peace, of integrating body, mind, and soul, a life that touches the hem of the spirit in the midst of all our struggles of living in a world that has become ever so globally interdependent, yet is so painfully torn apart. Now, this quote's about 20 years old, but I do not think it could be more astute to the moment we find ourselves in. Taken together, these perspectives suggest that among the spiritual but not religious, where religion signifies institutional belonging, ritualized practice, and shared belief systems, spirituality addresses the lived pursuit of meaning, purpose, and connectedness to self, to others, to nature, to the shared ground of being expressed in Arne Nass's outlining of the ecological web of life. Nass, the founder of deep ecology, described what he called the ecological self. Instead of seeing ourselves as isolated egos, Nass suggested we can identify with wider circles of life. First ourselves, then our family, then our community, then all living beings. This expansion of identity is not mystical in a supernatural sense. It is grounded in the spiritual recognition of mutual dependency and interconnection. In the call, to again borrow from Thich Nhat Hanh, for a vision of interbeing. We belong to each other, Hanh continues. We cannot cut reality into pieces. The well-being of this is the well-being of that, so we have to do things together. Every side is our side, end quote. For Nass and Hanh, when we experience this wider identity of interconnection, caring for nature or one another is no longer just moral duty. It is an expression of caring for our own larger self, right? In oneness, we find the capacity towards care. As Nass writes, we must learn to think and feel ourselves into the wider whole of life. Care flows naturally if the self is widened and deepened, so the protection of free nature is felt and conceived as a protection of our own very selves, end quote. To situate this more fully, let's dig deeper into what it means to be spiritual but not religious. Over the past several decades, the United States has witnessed a notable rise in the number of individuals who identify as spiritual but not religious, reflecting broader cultural shifts in how people approach faith, meaning, and belonging. This movement often signals a desire for authenticity and freedom, a refusal to accept rigid boundaries that might limit one's experience of the sacred. At its heart, it suggests that spirituality is not confined to institutions, but can be discovered in everyday acts of compassion, presence, and connection. According to Pew Research Center data, this is from 2023, they just released a new study, but I'm still working through that data, so I thought I'd use the data that I feel a little bit more comfortable with right now. Roughly 22% of US adults now describe themselves as spiritual, but not affiliated with any organized religion. An additional 48% identify as both spiritual and religious, highlighting the fluidity of contemporary spiritual identity. Just as a quick aside, most people want to create a kind of a strong binary. You're either this or you're either that. And really what we find in these studies are people who are often self-defining spirituality and religion or navigating these in relation to institutions that are defining it for them, but they don't always fit in nicely into those categories. Scholars note that this trend is part of a broader movement away from institutional authority and toward individualized, experiential, and exploratory approaches to spirituality. For many within this category of spiritual and religious, spirituality is less about formal doctrine or ritual attendance and more about cultivating personal meaning, purpose, and connection to others, nature, or a transcendent reality that might include God or that might simply be the recognition of how we are all interconnected. Everyday expressions of this phenomenon are apparent in the popularity of meditation apps, yoga classes, mindfulness practices, and online spiritual communities where people openly seek practices and perspectives that resonate with their own experiences rather than conforming to inherited religious structures. Yet the Pew findings tell us more. According to their 2023 survey, individuals who identify as spiritual and religious share many core spiritual beliefs with religious Americans, though their perspectives differ in important ways. A vast majority of the spiritual and religious, 89%, believe that people have a soul or spirit in addition to their physical body. and 88% feel that there's something spiritual beyond the natural world, levels comparable to religious respondents. However, members of the spiritual and religious are less likely than religious Americans to believe that deceased loved ones can be reunited after death, with 56% affirming this compared to 69% of religious adults. In contrast, members of the spiritual and religious are more inclined to attribute spiritual qualities to the natural world. 78% believe that animals can have a spirit or spiritual energies, and 71% extend this belief to parts of nature, such as mountains, rivers, or trees. These findings suggest that while the spiritual but not religious maintain a strong sense of spirituality, their focus often emphasizes the interconnectedness and spiritual energy of humanity in relation to each other and to the natural world, rather than traditional supernatural or afterlife beliefs. This landscape creates a spectrum of spiritual engagement, in which individuals may drift fluidly between curiosity, commitment, skepticism, and personal exploration, a dynamic that scholar Lisa Mercadante categorizes in her typology of spiritual but not religious experiences. In her oft-cited study of the spiritual but not religious, Mercadante identifies several distinct patterns of engagement, each reflecting a unique relationship to spiritual exploration and institutional religion. Among these are the explorers, who exhibit what she calls spiritual wanderlust, a restless curiosity that drives them to continually seek out new practices, experiences, and perspectives. These individuals often embrace the journey itself, rather than any alternate destination, and are comfortable without a fixed spiritual home. By contrast, seekers are motivated by a desire to find a spiritual home, sometimes revisiting earlier religious identities or searching for an entirely new group or tradition to which they can commit. For them, the spiritual and religious label signals both openness and intentionality. Another group, the immigrants, finds themselves in a novel spiritual environment and are actively navigating how to integrate this new identity and community into their lives, often testing and adjusting to a framework that still feels unfamiliar. Here we might find issues of either assimilation, where they might give up part of their identities, or what's sometimes called syncretism, where they seek to combine aspects of their original faith or spirituality with the new culture they find themselves in. Mercadante also identifies various forms of dissenters, who consciously distance themselves from institutional religion. Protesting dissenters have turned away due to negative personal experiences. Drifted dissenters have quietly fallen out of connection without intent to return, and conscientious objector dissenters maintain a principled skepticism toward organized religion, viewing it as unnecessary or even obstructive to personal spirituality. Finally, the category of casuals captures those who approach spirituality pragmatically as a functional or therapeutic resource rather than a central organizing principle. For these individuals, spiritual practices are tools for stress relief, emotional support, or personal well-being, rather than paths towards ultimate meaning. Together, these categories illustrate the diversity of experiences within the spiritual and religious population, highlighting the way individuals negotiate curiosity, commitment, and skepticism in shaping their spiritual lives. I want to mention that Mercadante's typological framework is enormously helpful in giving language to might otherwise feel amorphous. Yet her approach is not without its limitations. As a Christian theologian, Mercadante follows a common trend, reading spiritual and religious identities through lenses that are deeply shaped by institutional religion and primarily Christianity. This means she often highlights what she sees as missing: authority, community, or coherent doctrine, rather than what actually be emerging in these new forms of spirituality. And I think you actually saw that in the language, right? It's the way that she typically defines spirituality are people who are looking for a new religious home and not necessarily thinking about spirituality in its own light. The categories she uses, while I admit are very tidy and helpful, risk reducing the complexity of lived experience, overlooking the fact that many people move fluidly between identities or resist labels altogether. More subtly, her narrative can create the impression that the spiritual and religious are a weaker or less mature alternative to organized religion, right? Go play with your spirituality, at one point you'll actually find your religion, right? It kind of reduces people to that mentality, rather than seeing spirituality as a robust path in its own right. By focusing so heavily on the individualistic tendencies of the spiritual and religious, she downplays the communal and activist dimensions of the spiritualities emerging today. Think of ecological movements, meditation communities, or networks organized around compassion and justice. In these places, spirituality is anything but isolated. It is deeply relational, and it spills outward in the world in concrete acts of care. As such, we might tell a different story. Rather than treating the spiritual but not religious as deficient, we could see as an evolving response to the needs of our time. Many who identify this way are not rejecting depth, meaning, or community. They are rejecting narrow boundaries that no longer serve them. For example, in exploring the diverse landscape of contemporary spirituality, we can nuance Mercadante's typology with insight from a host of spiritual but not religious scholars. And I'm just going to name some scholars here in case you're interested. So this includes Robert C. Fuller, William Parsons, Catherine Albanese, Lee Schmidt, and Jeff Kripal, who distinguish several key groups within the broader spiritual but not religious population. For example, and this is a group you might be familiar with, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N, are those who, when asked, proclaim no affiliation with any recognized religious system, often in the context of surveys, although the degree of their personal commitment to spirituality is not always clear. Despite this lack of formal affiliation, many nuns, when you get deeper into their answers, maintain deeply held spiritual beliefs or practices. Right? So I hear, when people say, I don't belong to religion, but I practice meditation, for example. Right? They're making a very specific claim about what they think religion is. So many nuns maintain these deeply spiritual beliefs or practices. And again, this often ranges from meditation and mindfulness to a strong sense of ethical responsibility and connection to something larger than themselves. They just don't use the language of religion, or they think that religion, again, is too restrictive. Within the spiritual but not religious category, spirituality itself is framed as core to the human experience, connecting individuals to both personal and collective well-being and addressing fundamental concerns of purpose, meaning, and belonging. Spirituality in the context of spiritual but not religious often emphasizes compassion as a daily practice, rooted in relationships, care for the earth, and a sense of interconnectedness that extends beyond the walls of any institution. In this light, the spiritual but not religious movement can be read not as a fragmentation, but as creative syncretism, a willingness to weave together traditions, practices, and values into something that feels authentic and life-preserving. It represents an openness to transformation, a search for wholeness, and a recognition that love and responsibility for others are at the heart of any genuine spiritual path. Among these, believer spiritual but not religious reject the coherence of specific religious dogma and no longer identify with a former religious institution, yet retain a spiritual orientation grounded in a theological informed understanding of the sacred, divine, or transcendence, right? This goes back to that example of the young individual, the young man who told me, I am a follower of Jesus, but I am not Christian. Unaffiliated members of the spiritual but not religious preserve their spirituality and broader belief either as remnants of the religious system they once belonged to, from which they have disengaged, or as expressions of a spirituality developed independently of any institutionalized religious framework. For this group, spirituality might be very reflective of religious understanding, but they intentionally move away from affiliating their spirituality with religion, as religion is seen as a system that no longer supports or fortifies their beliefs or worldly orientation. For example, another student that I'm working with right now, I do a lot of these questions with students, explains that they still find their values and their virtues connected to their Christian identity. But as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, they can't align with at least their church setting that had told them, right, that their identity places them in a state of sin, right? So they still pull their virtues from that setting, but no longer can identify with that setting because of how it actually impacts who they see and know themselves to be. Institutional members of the spiritual and not religious situate spirituality within collective or communal settings, such as atheist or secular churches, which are massively on the rise. Within these contexts, spirituality actually expresses one of the etymological roots of religion, religio, which means to bind together, which emphasizes connection and shared practice over doctrinal content or theological commitments. These are people who do not want to be seen as a religion, but desperately desire the type of community, right, and fortification that ritual provides within the space of community. Finally, and this is probably the group that I spend the most time studying myself personally, we can identify therapeutic members of the spiritual not religious, which describes those who turn to spirituality as a way to strengthen well-being, resilience, and empathy. Their practices, which again range from meditation and mindfulness to reflective rituals, and often a combination thereof, aren't about doctrine, but about cultivating inner balance, emotional growth, and a deeper care for others and the world. Together, and again, there's limits here, and I'd love to hear feedback on these categories too, because it's things I'm trying to work through. These categories illustrate the range of ways individuals navigate the interplay between belief, community, and personal meaning, highlighting again the fluidity and adaptability of spirituality in contemporary contexts. While the category of the spiritual but not religious reflects important cultural shifts in the ways people pursue meaning, purpose, and belonging, and particularly ways contemporary people cultivate compassion and reciprocal responsibility, which we'll end our talk with today, it has also provoked strong critique from both religious and cultural commentators. These responses often cluster on three related concerns. First, that spirituality cannot be divorced from religion. They simply are bedfellows who cannot have one without the other. Second, that spirituality without religion risks becoming a hollow, a relativistic exercise. And third, that without God and religious institutions, society itself lacks a coherent moral framework. Now I'm going to unpack these critiques just so we can see them in light of what I'm going to end this talk with. First, many theologians argue that spirituality is simply inseparable from religion. Sandra Schneider, for example, in her influential definition of Christian spirituality, describes it as, quote, a lived experience of faith rooted in a religious tradition, nourished by scripture, theology, and communal practice. Right? The only way you get to spirituality is through the gaze, through the lens of religion. Similarly, classic sociologists, like we mentioned earlier, such as Durkheim, remind us that religion provides the very structures, rituals, symbols, and collective beliefs that make spirituality intelligible within a community. Society, as Durkheim and others contend, is the true soul of religion. From this perspective, attempts to pursue spirituality apart from religious institutions risk stripping it of the practices, narratives, and shared commitments that give it coherence and depth, that establish the conditions for social order. Second, critics contend that spirituality without religion leads to a world devoid of meaning and ethics. Here I'm going to use Friedrich Nietzsche, but not in the full way that we should read Nietzsche's critique of religion, right? I'm going to share with you the way that contemporary people who are making critique of the spiritual and religious actually turn to Nietzsche, take him out of context a little bit in order to make an argument about morality and coherency. So Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God in the Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra was not a celebration of secular freedom, but a warning that without the divine as a grounding for values, human beings would struggle to construct coherent systems of purpose and morality. Without the transcendent, Nietzsche suggested, culture risks lapsing into nihilism, where anything goes and life itself loses inherent meaning. As Nietzsche writes in The Madman, quote, this is the long quote you see here, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? This is my favorite next line. What festivals of atonement, what sacred games should we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Similarly, as Dostoevsky echoes in a moment from the brothers Karamazov, here I'm going to quote the actual quote, not what we see here. But what will become of men then, I asked him, without God and immortal life? All things are permitted then. They can do what they like, end quote. This claim, this moment from the brothers Karamazov, has been simplified into the meme that you see up on the slide. If God does not exist, everything is permissible, is the essential argument. Again, ignoring the liberatory potential that Nietzsche actually connects with the loss of God, or what Dostoevsky is trying to actually say in that commentary in the brothers Karamazov, cultural voices today reify this concern. That again, without God, we lose any sense of moral direction and the capacity for cohesion. Conservative commentator and religiously observant Jew Ben Shapiro writes the following: without God, there's no right or wrong, anything goes, life loses value, and with that loss of the value comes a loss of societal strength, end quote. Now I quote here from Shapiro intentionally, because if my talk is going a different direction, right, I would make the argument directly against what Shapiro's saying. Shapiro's saying that we lose a sense of cohesion and moral direction without the presence of God. And yet he's also a figure who's arguing for a type of theocracy that can impose its will upon all people, right? So I just want to show kind of the directionality of all this. At its best, if we take this argument, such critiques frame the spiritual and religious identity as a form of spiritual consumerism, picking and choosing practices for comfort or well-being while avoiding the deeper moral demands of a tradition that, in the perspective of people like Shapiro, not only shape individual moral behavior, but construct the ethical norms of a society. So at its worst, the spiritual and religious represent a deep moral threat to the coherency of social cohesion by getting rid of the guideposts offered by religious systems. Third, and correspondingly, religious leaders and cultural critics argue that without God and religious institutions, society itself simply cannot sustain a coherent moral order. Catholic theologian David Tracy, for example, insists that religion provides not only individual guidance, but also the communal narratives necessary to sustain justice, ethics, and the common good. Likewise, sociologist Peter Berger, following Durkheim, identified religious institutions as serving as sacred canopies, under which shared values and social norms are maintained. Without these institutions, critics suggest, moral norms become fragmented, reduced to subjective preference rather than collective obligation. As Alistair MacIntyre observes in After Virtue, the erosion of religiously grounded moral frameworks leaves society vulnerable to individualism and relativism, eroding the very possibility of a shared vision of the good. Collectively, these theological and cultural voices articulate a moral critique of the spiritual and religious. They argue that spirituality divorced from religion is not simply an alternative path, but a fragile and potentially dangerous substitute, lacking the grounding, coherence, and communal depth that religious traditions uniquely provide. In light of these concerns, and in direct response to the rapid growth of spiritual and religious identity, several contemporary voices argue that reviving church participation is therefore essential, not only for individual flourishing, but also for the health of society as a whole. Pew Research Center's 2023 study on spirituality notes that while many Americans claim to be spiritual, far fewer believe that organized religion provides meaning or belonging, with one report concluding that the spiritual and religious, quote, are more likely than religious Americans to see organized religion as divisive and less essential to society, end quote. The Barna Group, a research firm dedicated to providing actionable insights on faith and culture, with a particular focus on the Christian church, describes the love Jesus, not the church population, as a pressing pastoral challenge. Knowing these individuals remain open to faith, but deeply distrust religious institutions, and arguing that, quote, re-engagement requires churches to listen to their stories, address wounds, and invite them back into authentic community, end quote. Similarly, sociological research underscores what is lost when institutional religion declines. One study published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion found that people embedded in congregational life reported higher levels of social support and psychological well-being, whereas those identifying only as spiritual experienced weaker social networks and higher risks of isolation. As an aside, this study is exceedingly limited by a privileging of religion and a tendency to define spirituality only in light of religiosity and religious conviction. That's one of the greatest challenges with these surveys and studies, is they always make them so contingent that spirituality is seen through the lens of religion. Theological voices make this point even more forcefully, which I'm sure we can imagine. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, insists that Christianity without the church risks becoming little more than, quote, a set of private preferences, end quote. Whereas the church grounds faith in, quote, discipline, accountability, and shared memory, end quote. These cultural, sociological, and theological perspectives challenge the spiritual but not religious position by arguing that while private spirituality may offer comfort, only religious institutions can provide the communal depth, ethical grounding, and continuity necessary for a moral and flourishing society. Yet is this the whole story? Where does all this leave us, and what can we conclude, and how might we move forward? While these perspectives rightly stress the historical and ongoing communal and ethical benefits of organized religion, they ultimately risk narrowing the scope of spirituality by binding it too tightly to institutional life or expressions of faith. Such an approach overlooks the way spirituality itself functions as a fundamental part of the human journey, an ongoing search for purpose, meaning, and belonging that cannot be reduced to belief or church participation alone. When understood in this broader context or broader sense, spirituality points to not only private comfort, but also to a reciprocal responsibility grounded in compassion, one that equips individuals to cultivate personal integrity and enhance the common good. Seen in this light, spirituality emerges not merely as a supplement to religion, but as an applied approach to living that embraces mutuality and finds expression through compassion. As Philip Sheldrake details, and Philip Sheldrake is a theologian, but probably the figure most important in establishing the study of spirituality as an academic field. Sheldrake writes the following. He says, spirituality is not simply concerned with religious devotion or spiritual practices, but also how to live in a virtuous way. Equally, ethics is not merely concerned with right and wrong actions, but also with people's dispositions of character. In other words, both spirituality and ethics focus on the quality of our basic humanity, end quote. By focusing on the quality of what it means to be human, spirituality emerges as the means for cultivating humanity, which includes love and a commitment to the good of society. In other words, when seen in its own light, spirituality signals ways of navigating existence aimed at cultivating a more virtuous individual life and a more just social world. In an effort to illustrate this, please indulge me as I share a bit about myself and my relationship to spirituality. In both my research and in my life, I explore and engage spirituality as various ways humans choose to act relationally, highlighting, for example, the Dalai Lama's emphasis on compassion as the essence of spirituality. Emerging from the base recognition of interconnection, what in Buddhism is known as pratitya samuppada, The Dalai Lama stresses how, quote, in order to overcome our tendency to ignore others' needs and rights, we must continually remind ourselves what is obvious, that basically we are all the same, end quote. Within this recognition, we find the kernel for spirituality, and the reason why embracing a spiritual approach to life can result in compassionate action. In fact, according to scholar of religion and former religious sister Karen Armstrong, compassion is the test of true spirituality, end quote. It is expressive of the golden rule and compels individuals not to confine benevolence to your own group, but rather challenges each of us, and here I'm going to quote from Armstrong again, quote, to look into our own hearts, discover what gives us pain, and then refuse, under any circumstance whatsoever, to inflict that pain on anybody else. Compassion can be defined, therefore, as an attitude of principled, consistent altruism. Right? One of the things we miss about compassion is not simply the recognition of another's suffering, but the willingness to intervene, to try to alleviate that suffering to the best of our ability. And here, I'm going to go a little off script and talk a little bit about myself, my own journey, as a way to illustrate all this. So I was born into a mixed religious household, two hippie parents, one who grew up as a military brat, the other who grew up in a Jewish household. I was raised Jewish, I was bar mitzvahed, but I will admit that I was one of those journeyers and questioners from the beginning. My Hebrew name was Yershon, and we had Hebrew school every Tuesday and Thursday, and every Tuesday and Thursday I heard the following: Yershon, go see the rabbi. Because every time when we were sitting in those class, something would come up and I'd say, how do I align a sense of an all-good God with Noah's flood? Yershon, you're missing the point. Maybe, but again, how do we arrive here? And so I had these great conversations. What I came to realize for myself is that I had a very hard personal time aligning myself with belief in a higher power. But the teachings that are embedded within my Jewish identity still stay with me today. So there's two principles that always stood out to me. The first is gemalut chasadim, which technically means acts of loving kindness or caring for others, and then tikkun olam, to repair a world. That amidst all these theological conversations, what interests me was how we choose to live with others, right? How we choose to interact. And if we see ourselves, as Martin Heidegger says, is that we're beings in this world and we're beings with others, then what choices do we make? And to me, that choice is not predicated on belief in something, but how I chose to act. Do I choose to act with loving kindness? Do I choose to celebrate in the joys of others? Do I choose to tear them down? And as Karen Armstrong said, under no circumstance do I seek to inflict that pain. And that message was embedded in me by my parents, right? And incredibly, I feel blessed to have parents who love me endlessly, who are willing to put up with my idiosyncrasies, right? But it was also my grandma who used to hear this, my grandma Candy, right? My grandma Candy, this is a memory that sticks with me, right? My longest memory I have from her, she would call me on Friday. I have three siblings. She'd call us and we'd kind of go around the circle talking to Grandma Candy. I get on the phone and she'd always say the same thing. So how the conversation began. She'd say, Mushugana. Shugana is like a Yiddish word for crazy one. It's not always used in the best context. She meant it in a positive one, because if you think I have a lot of like manic energy now, I just imagine he's like a 6-year-old. So she'd say, Mushugana, what was your mitzvah for the week? Now, if you know what mitzvah means, it technically means commandment, right? And God gives the Jewish people 613 commandments. Things you should do and that you should not do. But there's a cultural meaning to mitzvah, and that cultural meaning is good deed. So my grandma Candy would ask me this question. She was not asking me if I kept kosher or if I kept this commandment. She was asking me, what was my good deed for that week? And that has been embedded upon my soul and upon my heart. I wake up every day and I ask myself, what is the intention I seek to do today? What is the mitzvah I am attempting to do? At the end of every day, I then reflect on that. What have I done, and what can I choose to do better in the future, right? It's how I live my life. It's how I think about my ethics and my virtues. It's how I seek to interact with my wife, who I've been with since high school. It's how I seek to interact with my children. It's how I seek to interact with my students. It's how I seek to interact on a daily basis. What was your mitzvah? Now that is embedded in that religious identity, but I never saw it as contingent on me being Jewish, rather contingent on the way I chose to act, right? Relationally with others. I fortify this today, and it's embedded in my soul because of my sense of interconnection to others, right? So just really quickly, how do I come to see this? How do I manifest it? How do I invigorate myself? Well, on the one hand, nature shows me the beauty of life. This is, I did a symposium in Concord, Massachusetts on the Transcendentalists, and every morning for 2 weeks, I walked the Rose Walk to Walden Pond to catch the sunrise. This is one of the sunrises that I caught. spectacular, beautiful, right? But how do you not live in awe and reverence to see something like that? In the middle is a yellow finch. It's my favorite bird. We actually call it the EYF, the elusive yellow finch. About twice a year, my family and I see it. It's like our excitement point. The yellow finches return. Yellow finches also typically fly together in pairs. They partner up for life, which is a beautiful idea. I'm a deadhead at heart, so music, being in community, being in the reverence, but then it's really my family, right? So this is Golden Gate Park. This is where I proposed to my wife. That's my wife and I holding hands. We are high school sweethearts. We've been together since 1999, so it's been 26 years that we've been together. And those are my 4 babies, right? And on the one level, when I see them and engage them and think about that love, on the one hand, it tells me that there's always something bigger than myself. But it also shows me I have certain responsibilities, and that love is a condition that shouldn't be restricted to this. It's inspired by this, but it's dedicated outwards towards others. So I see this in my teaching, right, and what I try to do. I teach class on peace building, I teach class on altruism. I emphasize a lot of spiritual practices based on compassion and resiliency and how we think about our own well-being. I teach a lot in relation to climate and responsibility. I teach my students a lot of practices. Most of my classes are mired in practicums of how we actually can regulate ourselves and deal with the stress we find ourselves in. My students have started community farms. They've done peace building missions. I teach class on peace building. And so these values, these virtues that begin with my grandma asking that question, what was your mitzvah, situate how I chose to operate in this world and what I choose to study and how I choose to study it and how I choose to teach, right? So let me end then, this last thing I promise, with 2 final quotes that capture the essence of today's talk and that together define the way that I pursue spirituality as an individual, as a scholar, and as a teacher. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel reminds us, our goal should be to live in radical amazement. Get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed. And once we embrace this amazement, we experience a reality of contingency, compassion, and love. For as the Dalai Lama teaches, it is because our own existence is so dependent on the help of others that our need for love lies at the very foundation of our existence. Therefore, we need a genuine sense of responsibility and a sincere concern for the welfare of others. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Yes. Thanks. So one of the questions that came up last night in our affiliate faculty gathering was if, in fact, the Dalai Lama quotation is correct, that compassion is the essence of spirituality. You have to call it spirituality?
No. I mean, I think this is a challenge of someone who wants, like, I think we can go one of 2 routes, right? Maybe we do need a new term. Maybe we need to find something that expresses this category that is not mired in so much baggage, right? Again, the etymological roots, the first way that we see spirituality emerge is in the context of Christianity. And therefore, it is embedded in that narrative. It is embedded in that discourse. And so that can be difficult for people to untwine together. But I think at least in this current moment, we need to take stock of how individual people respond to that question when it comes to belief, connection to others, and very often they will use that term spirituality. So I don't think we need it, but it's the term right now that's the best standing for what I think people are trying to capture as something that goes beyond just our physiological existence to describe something else.
So another question that came up, and this is directly related, is why is it that people are using that word? And so my hypothesis is that we don't want to upset our mothers. I can tell you from experience as somebody who for 17 years was a Christian theologian teaching at a seminary, that when I left the church, my mom said, please don't tell me that you're an atheist. And I said, I'm just returning to the question. And I left it at that. And likewise, people will say, oh, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic, because it's softer. They might say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, as a way to be more accepted.
I think that's part of it, right? I do think that there is a sense of both with, let's say, your familiar aspect, right? Most of us, the religious identity, at least that we have as children, or what we are socialized into. right? We are enculturated and brought into this world, and if you're born into a Christian household, you're likely to be Christian. Now, that may change at some point, right? But that initial context is what produces community, right? It gives us guidance, it binds our families together. And so I do think there's that tendency where it's easier to use language that is already familiar. And the idea of atheism, I would say especially, I think it's changing a little bit over the last decade, right? I think if you go back to 80s, 90s, and early aughts, that's you would have got more of that answer. Oh, no, I'm spiritual. I'm definitely not atheist though, right? That emphasis there. I think that's what the nuns are trying to do, right? When they answer that, they're simply trying to say I don't know. Why are you trying to put a label on the way that I'm trying to operate, exist within this world? Which is why those surveys are often so limited, because you're just asking someone what is your religious? Are you religious? Are you not religious? What's your affiliation? And they say none. That doesn't actually tell us much, right? And so then when you start getting those deeper conversations, people willfully start using the language of religion and spirituality. I think it's because of what they feel comfortable with. It's what they've been socialized in. They know it's somewhat of a shared language they can have with others. But I am open. And I think when I talk with people who are members of this community, or even think about it for myself, I'm not sure. For me, one of the reasons of using spirituality is valuable, though, it goes back to when I introduced one of the roots, spiritus, right? Meaning breath and breathing. It suggests that to be a human, to be alive, is to be a spiritual being. And if anyone's familiar with the work of Lisa Miller, Dr. Lisa Miller, she's out of Columbia University. She wrote a great book called The Awakened Brain, right? She studies kind of what happens in our neurology, right? What happens in our kind of a neuroscientific understanding. And when people function within spiritual context, right? It's showing that something's happening within us, right? So she actually argues that there is biological evidence for us to be spiritual, right? But some of this is just a language beat. And I think it sometimes is not to overly rock the boat, because when I talk to people who do want to claim I'm a pure secularist, I'm a pure atheist, they're looking often for more of an argument and debate, right? So they're open to having that conversation. So it's not even so much their identity, it's more I want to just argue about this topic, right? And then so when you start nuancing it, they often express things like, I'm an atheist, but I did this practice. I'm why isn't that not a ritual practice? Why is that not spiritual? Well, for them, those things are too much connected.
So you have out there online a manual on spiritual practices and on things to try. And it seems to me that at the core of that is curiosity. And we're standing here in front of an image of the Lenin Peace Wall in Prague, right? And it's changing all the time. It used to change every night because they would go paint over it and people would come back to paint. All the people that contribute to that are coming from a lot of perspectives, but they do have something in common, and that is a belief in peace, a belief in justice, which again, they might identify with all kinds of different things. I sometimes will do a little yoga. Not much, not often. I'm afraid of the word practice because it means I'm committing to something for a really long time. And I just do it because I need to stretch, okay? So if I do, I need to stretch a little yoga, but I'm not thinking at all that I'm connecting to the ultimate, that I'm connecting to something transcendent, that I'm rooted to the ground on which my bare feet stand. I'm just doing it to stretch. Am I missing something? Am I somehow not whole in the language that you're using?
No. So I think that I would say a couple of things, right? I do think that the manual I wrote was predicated based on that idea of curiosity, right? That is, people are thinking about how do I respond to my need for well-being? How do I build up resiliency? How do I respond to stress? Right? I'm actually teaching a class right now called Flourishing Under Stress. And what I'm doing is I'm introducing a whole host of ways that people attend to the idea of flourishing, which is not universal. People flourish and experience life in very different ways, right? It often has an ableist language to it that all people are going to flourish or exist in the same way. But also, how do we respond to a world that is often beyond our control? So on one hand, curiosity opens space, right? So one example I can give you are a category of people who call themselves Jews, right? These are people who at the theological religious belief level are Jewish, right? So they follow Torah, they believe in God, right? They go to synagogue, but they don't find the rituals connected to Judaism to be fortifying. So they turn to Buddhist practices of mindfulness. So they primarily practice kind of meditative mindfulness. That's their practice, but their religion is Jewish, so hence Jew-Buddhist. There's a lot.
I just heard that term the first time yesterday afternoon, when I was telling a Jewish friend about your being here and who you are, and they said, oh, he's a Jew.
Yeah, yeah. And so part of it, I wouldn't deny that. I mean, I think, my own practice, to your point, is I do a lot of walking meditation in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, right? How do I get rid of the stress of a class, the stress of a meeting, when I'm going to meet students or trying to go home to my kids, I don't want to carry that stress with me. So I walk back and forth to campus every day. And I take that time mindfully walking on the ground, feeling embedded. So I'd actually say when your feet are on the ground, you're stretching, there's something else happening there, right? To feel myself present, to recognize the things that I've gone through, recognize what I can control and not control. And so when I enter the house, I can kind of release all that for the moment and be present with my kids. So I don't carry that with me, right? And when I do carry it with me, they call me out on it, which I love. Dad, go back outside, right? Go for another walk. Like, get that balance for yourself. So I think on the one hand, yeah, so there's categories of people who do it. Like, so what I would argue though too is that there's a lot of people who choose to do things like yogic practices for purely bodily exercise, right? There's others who choose to do it intentionally for more of the religious settings. With yoga, Buddhist mindfulness, we always have to be concerned about the consumerization of it, the appropriation of it, taking out its traditions, what is lost when you do practices. But I've also had a lot of students who found their way into, let's say, a yoga studio solely for the reason you're staying. But they were introduced to something else. And in that process of being introduced to something else, they realize that the movements they're going through with their bodies are actually allowing them to release certain stressors and open themselves up to new experiences. And that's a deeply spiritual encounter. So on the one hand, it may not be their intention they get something from it. There may be those who don't even understand it. I've been in class where students been like, wait, what do you mean yoga comes out of a tradition? I'm like, what has been your experience? Like, well, I grew up in an area, I came here to state, I saw a yoga studio, I wanted to do it. I had no idea it has the context in Hinduism historically. So I think there's a certain intentionality. I'd say that there's curiosity and then intentionality. Practices can be chosen for purely well-being or health reasons. We have to think about how those are being sold and how they're being commoditized. At the same time, I think that even in that process, people might be gaining something deeper than they realize. And so maybe this language of spirituality and religion gives them some tools to start thinking about those other things that they're gaining, even if they weren't intending to do so.
Thank you. I believe we have a couple of microphones. There's one right in the back right now. Guys.
No, thanks so much. So you're going to give me a minute. It takes me a little time to formulate what I'm going to say. From my perspective, again, I'm not the scholar or anything, but when I look at spirituality and religion, we initially talked about spirituality and definitions. We're not going to provide the definition, but rather what it was. I think that's a reasonable approach because that the point that you are making that you don't necessarily have to be religious, if I understood that right, that for you to be spiritual. From my perspective, the way I'm looking at this is, I think that's completely contradictory. And the reason, I'm going to give you the reasoning is, without a creator, there is no morals, the way that you talked about at the end. And without morals, the religion gives the morals, and subsequently, then you may choose, there are different ways of spirituality. The way I find why people are going away from the theology or being a God viewer is because there has been, as I said, in terms of the institution, there is somebody between God and you. If we're majority of us, or majority of what I believe, what we are looking for is the direct connection with God. And the spirituality, I believe, might be the way that they connect or feel that there is a connection without an intermediary where it might have to go to a rabbi or somebody else to say, hey, what do I do in this case? We are all, at least I believe, made in the image of God, so we can have a direct connection. And to divorce creator, whatever form you consider that from spirituality, then the spirituality just becomes another fashion that will be there for maybe, another decade, something like it.
I appreciate the comment. I think that that's a story and that's a reality and that's true for a lot of people. I don't think we should ignore that. I think that you capture a couple of things that for many people, I don't want to take this away at all, that again, you can't unwed those two, right? To be religious is to be spiritual, to be spiritual is to be religious. And when I talk to people like that, they often make that last claim you're making, that what has happened to them within the realm of religion is that the mediation, the divide, the moving away, the grounding too much kind of in earthly concerns, right, or like, let's say, earthly authorities, prevents them from actually encountering the divine however they might understand it, right? That is true of the vast majority of the population, right? But the question becomes is, what do you do with those people who do not see it that way? What do you do with people who make the claim that there is no creator, right? In a very basic kind of atheist perspective, there is no creator. We are beings derived from a natural process who find ourselves here together. And there's routes you can take, and that's why I want to share some of those arguments. Some of those arguments are that without that force above us, without being created in the image, there is no morality. There's no morality, we lose social cohesion, right? The counterpoint to that, though, is that, I was hoping to share with some of these other traditions or something like within Buddhism, right? Buddhism does not necessarily have always a theistic or theological orientation, depending on the type of Buddhism you're looking for. But it's mired in certain principles of interconnection and dependency, right? Think for a minute all the amazing things that have happened for us to be here tonight, right? The fact that there were two bodies that came together at some point in all our lives to produce who we are as humans, that we were cultivated and raised in different settings, that we ultimately find ourselves here in a building that none of us built, using technology that none of us invented in order to share this experience together. Now, I could argue that to me, that's a proof, right, of not just our level of connection, but our level of dependency upon one another. And I can use that dependency as the basis for my morality, right? I do not need somebody to tell me how to be moral. Rather, I can see that to be dependent is to be responsible, and to be responsible is a claim towards morality, right? So I do not want to take away anything you said. I think that you made a clear perspective as to what I wanted to begin this talk with, right? That that has been not only the way in which religion and spirituality have been understood, but for many people, 54% of the global population and more in the United States, right? When you think about percentage of people who claim to be religious, that is often exactly what they'll say. And having this belief in something beyond myself, that provides the guidance and the tools of morality in order to exist. And I do agree with you that a lot of folks who move away from religion and who fall, these are the people I call like the unaffiliated spiritual religious. The issue is that mediator, right? I no longer need it. Here I'm thinking about even like Martin Luther's, right, 95 Theses. Right, part of that critique was you all have become so contingently connected to the institution of the Catholic Church, you're not actually connected to God. So go back to the Bible and experience it yourself. So there's this long history that takes us into like Unitarianism, that takes us into Transcendentalists. But where I push back, I think, is that that's one route, but the other route, and the route I'm simply trying to understand in many ways, is that for those who do not see it as contingent, and for those who more so, at least in this moment they find themselves in, do not find themselves aligning with belief in a higher power or creator, right? What leads to movements of compassion and justice that we see that are not based on religion, but based on a sense of dependent responsibility to one another? And I argue back to maybe the question you asked, Bob, that in calling that spirituality, it's helping us elevate that as not just a happenstance, but as a choice, which is why I kind of shared my end point about myself is the choices I'm making. So I really appreciate your comment because I think it's important for us to recognize that these are these exact debates that I'm trying to work through. Back to Bob's point, maybe we need new language, right, for these categories, or maybe we need to think about those categories themselves and how do we share a relationship between someone who might be in your position, right, creator, creating the image of God, and how that fortifies your sense of morality, as somebody who either does not believe or maybe they never were given the opportunity, right? They're raised in a context in which they never had that movement of faith, right? As Soren Kierkegaard tells us, faith is a leap, right? And not everyone can make that leap and land gracefully. And so when they don't land gracefully, where do they find themselves? And I would argue they can still find themselves in deeply moral positions. And that morality is based on a sense of connection we have to one another simply by our fact that we exist here in this space. Thank you.
So again, our image here for Lennon Peace Wall And the words across the top there, imagine. The song that begins is imagine there's no heaven. For me, if you'll indulge me just one extra moment here. One of the things that I saw within Christian theology as a professor was that people who said that they should believe on, they should agree on a great deal, agreed on method, agreed on basic doctrine, agreed on infallibility of scripture, agreed on all kinds of things, disagreed radically on some basic ethical questions. And that to me was always a problem. It was always an issue. I approached it as an interpretive problem. You know, you're not reading it right. You're not reading the tradition right, or you're not reading the Bible properly. And so I would assert, for example, when teaching on women's rights and women having full and equal rights with men, teaching from a biblical perspective to teach that, I got a lot of pushback from people who said, oh, you're not reading the Bible correctly. It asserts a male authority in a different way. And what was especially interesting to me was when I began to read feminist Muslim theologians. And I saw that they were making the same arguments that I was making, but about a different book. They were arguing for the same interpretive principles that I was using, redemptive movement, all these same kinds of phrases. And at the same time, there were some human rights reservations being made by Arab states, specifically Saudi Arabia, in its reservations to the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. They were drawing from American evangelical Christian theology to argue for different roles of men and women with equal dignity but different rights. And I realized we were, as more egalitarian, more feminist theologians, in agreement from different books. And the more conservative ones, the more patriarchal ones, were in agreement from different books. So my lesson out of that was, it doesn't really matter which book you're reading, and it doesn't really matter whether you're reading a book. The thing that matters is whether you believe in women's rights or not. And so that brought me more deeply into the human rights tradition. And so one more tiny story, Jacques Maritain, in the UNESCO document that preceded the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, Maritain summarized the work of the surveys that they had taken worldwide of religious leaders, government leaders, about what should go into a human rights document. So he concluded in the introduction to his summary, we agree on the rights, but on the condition that no one asks us why. And so what he was saying is there were people from all over the world, from different faith traditions, that believed the same thing about what justice looked like. And they were going to stand together for that. And that's where I found myself.
I think I appreciate you sharing that, Bob. I think it's a beautiful message, it's a beautiful underlying tone. I think in the end, what you capture is a sense of interpretive positioning, right? These documents have a certain level of interpretation. So just one quick thing, and I love questions, but just to build on what you said, if you take a single document, right? So we go to the first book within the Old Testament for Christians, within Torah for Jews, within Muslims read the Torah too, they see it as a sacred text. Or we go to the moment in which Adam is created and then Eve comes, right? So just based on what you're saying, there's a long history of interpreting that story to say man is first, woman is second. Literally, woman comes from man, and therefore woman is designed to be a helpmate for man who is chosen by God to be the steward. Well, within Jewish feminist circles, for example, they go to Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and they take that same story, but they read the Hebrew differently.
Yeah.
But rather than Adam being created and Eve, they imagine an androgynous body, right? A body that's male facing one way and female facing the other way. And what God does is God actually creates them simultaneously and then separates them to look at each other as equals. And as they say, like in a cute way, you run your hand along your back and you feel those bumps. That's a reminder of your one's interconnection. So same story, but interpreted in very, very different ways. And those different ways manifest then into very different types of social order, empowerment, disenfranchisement, oppression, etc. Let alone, like you said, then interpret from different texts, right?
Right. And then again, for me, one of the basic lessons of that is that there absolutely can be morality from both books or from no books. If again, your morality is that you are demonstrating compassion, that you're striving for justice, that you're advocating for rights, it doesn't matter how you source it. It's a question.
Following up on that, this sort of observation or question, I wonder if this is somehow a Western issue or a Judeo-Christian kind of issue. Bob was talking about the search for curiosity. I mean, there's a long tradition in Western culture of people in search of these things, this idea of spirituality, whatever you want to call it. I personally know people growing up who, were turning towards esoteric things, the Native American, Hinduism, Buddhism. There's a long history of Westerners going to the East in search of this type of enlightenment, of seeking something. And I could be totally off base here, but I don't know so much of that tradition in reverse, of Buddhists or Hindus looking for something else or something, or even in Islam. I mean, there are people who drop out or who reject religion, but not that same type of quest for something more that really seems particular to the Western. I wasn't going to say Christian, but then when you told your story, the Jews I'd never heard of before. But I wonder if there's something there that is different that we don't see in these other religious traditions in the East or in Islam or in other cultures.
No, I would say I think you could even go a little bit further and say, at least in the context of what I'm studying and who I'm talking about, it's not just Western, it's the United States in a really specific way, right? And the book I'm working on right now is the spiritual, not religious, has often been positioned as a type of identity that emerges primarily like starting after World War II, right? So in the great existential angst in light of the Holocaust, but also the dropping of atomic bombs, the reality that life was truly potentially endable. We saw it in the American context, the doubling down on Christianity in the 1950s, right? In God we trust is put on the currency. You get the rise of prosperity gospels. You get the embeddedness of religion among politicos in a much stronger way that we still see today, where people are constantly vying for their political bona fides. But at the same time, you see a pretty strong shift. How can you explain God in light of the Holocaust? So another group that emerges out of this, let's say in the American context, are Jews who came from Europe, that either escaped or came right after, and they, in my own state of Michigan, started humanistic Judaism, right? I can't believe in God in light of the Holocaust. Those things cannot align. But I still take, like myself, I still take values, I still find community within Judaism. So I would even go a little bit further, like you said, that a lot of what I'm talking about, the context, is really not just Western, but in the context of the United States, right? And then there's that long history. Again, you can go back to the Transcendentalists and the way they're getting early versions of the Bhagavad Gita and reading those entirely out of the wrong way, by helping Americans think about curiosity and difference, right? Moving away from a theistic God beyond, right? A transcendent God to the immanence found within Brahman. So I actually argue in my work that part of the spiritual, not religious identity is wed to American notions of freedom. You can find it within deism, you go through the Transcendentalists, you find it in new religious movements like theosophy. It takes off in the 1960s and 70s counterculture, and then we see today even more fortified in our digital age. So it's a great observation you make. The one thing I would say, right, is that what I do see elsewhere, though, right, is that what might be different is that within specifically within Judeo-Christian kind of context and Islam, so within the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, those religions are predicated on a faith and belief in God and that God directing how humans should act, right? And it's often some type of disparity within that context that leads people away. We see something similar though within Buddhism and Hindu context, I would argue, because what Buddhism and Hinduism have built into their very structures is a sense of curiosity and exploration, right? That part of Hinduism example is to follow the Purusharthas, 4 ways of living in this world. You live in this world, you experience your visceral real body, right? This is karma. You seek out material well-being, but you ultimately follow dharma, the cosmic law, which means that there is no single thing that we call Hinduism, right? Hinduism is a Western word that we impose as a way to try to organize this massive expression of people who are trying to navigate the world based on certain religious positions, but very different. And I think Buddhism is another great example of that, because you have a lot of people who are Buddhists, but don't even use that category, right? Because they don't belong to a sangha, they don't belong to a community, right? But they very much are based on the Buddhist teachings on the truth of suffering and the need for us to act. And so I think that it's, in the Western context, it's actually this type of breaking out of institutions that makes it more noticeable in the way that I'm describing it. But in non-Western contexts, some of what the spiritual religions are actually experiencing are based in those religious traditions, which is why, let's say, Westerners, I think about like Jack Kerouac, Dharma bums, carrying a backpack, people like Richard Alpert, who goes to India and comes back as Ram Dass, right? What they're finding over there was the exact thing that they could not find here. They had to literally break out of the Western gaze. And now sometimes there's a lot of problems with that, right? A lot of my work deals with issues of appropriation, issues of consumption, consumerism. I do a lot exactly like this with the neoliberalization of spirituality, right, and religion. But part of it was like, I'm trapped, right? And then our new digital moment, I think it opens up more avenues. Part of me writing that spiritual practice piece was really to say, like, these practices are surrounding us, but you have to be willing to be curious and put yourself in a situation that might never been in. Right, so I teach my students mindfulness meditation. I'm teaching a class right now on mindfulness in nature. And the very first day I did it, they're just like, wait, you want me to close my eyes? Like, you don't have to, I'm gonna invite you in. No, right? Because to them, it was a certain vulnerability they did not want to give themselves over to. All right, so I think it's a great point you make. And I'd actually just say that, at least for my talk, and thinking about my talk, maybe I need to situate this up front a little bit more, I'll be honest with that, because I do it in my book, is that I'm really trying to study this right now from this perspective that I find myself in. Ultimately, my hope is that we can think more globally about this, but that requires us to think about the long history of colonialism and imperialism that has often used religion as a tool to justify intervention in other places, right? Religion is really an invention of Western scholars. I would even argue more like Western colonialists, right? That could use religion then as a source to say, you have the wrong community, you have the wrong morality, you have the wrong virtues. Let us bring in our, whatever it might be, right? And use that as a way to construct this new community. Thank you for the point. I really love it.
So let me do one and then I'll go back to you. So the full name of the building in which we are is the Richard Mothe Center for Faith, Spirituality, and Social Justice. So you kind of have all 3 of those pieces, right? So faith, maybe a little bit more of a religion term, faith in God or at least a set of principles, faith in something, spirituality, which we've been all over, and then social justice. I would say that some of us might emphasize one or more of those. Others would say they hold all 3 in perfect union. My question to you is, can you do the first 2 right without the third? Can you do the faith and spirituality part right without it turning your face toward the rest of the world? And maybe right's the wrong question.
No, I know what you're saying though. I always think it's best to be honest, and I think that this is something my students either really like about me or not. I personally feel that way. I feel that when you come to embrace it, when you come to embrace religion or faith or spirituality, I do not see how that does not lead you into a relational mode with others. Right? You find in religious principles, right? Ahimsa in Hinduism, this idea of nonviolence or non-injury. We think about Buddhist principles of what calls it empathetic joy, to literally celebrate in the joy and happiness of another. It's a beautiful principle. Christ says all the commandments of Judaism can go like this: love God with all your will, love your neighbor as thyself. Muhammad says, right, it is you do an atom's weight of good, you shall see heaven. You should do an atom's weight of evil, you shall see hell. Right? But going beyond even that, so I do think there's a way that it leads there, but I do teach a class, and this entire class is on spirituality and peace building. But I began with the fact that peace building often emerges out of the application of religion to justify injustice. Because if I say, as Bob Dylan said, God is on my side, then how can I can pretty much do anything. I can justify any principle. I can say that you're the wrong identity. I can say that you're the wrong community to be here. That if you don't assimilate, that if you don't change, that you don't convert, there's something inevitably wrong with you, right? Religion has been a cudgel, right, upon endless amounts of people. At the same time, when I shift into peace building and peacemaking and justice movements, it's hard not to see religion and spirituality as the bedrock out of which those emerge. Even if it's not explicitly a religious or spiritual organization, often the people who are motivated, called to that life of service, right, are connected there. So I teach a class on spiritual journeys and spiritual awakening. I'm teaching it right now. And the whole point is to arrive here. That if we really come to see our spirituality, we may express it in different ways, right? But the outcome of it is what's going to be shared. And that outcome is going to be creating space for you and me to live in this space together.
I always get nervous about our faith or spirituality causing us to withdraw from the world. And sometimes the individuality of self-exploration, the curiosity that causes one to withdraw, could leave out everybody else.
Yes.
And likewise, the application of some traditional theological principles like providence could cause some people to say, well, God's got it all under control. I don't really need to do anything right.
Right.
And so there's always a danger that we miss something really significant in the name of some kind of piety.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, and I think that's especially troubling maybe today when I think about the amount of especially young people who are finding spiritual guidance through digital virtual relationships that more and more aren't actually relationships, right? And so this is why we need to study it. This is why we need to go back to your other question, give it some name so we can understand it. Because that sense of withdrawal, right? We see it among ascetics, right? Who are so committed to their piety, I'm going to commit nothing to the world. On the one hand, we could argue that they're not actually then damaging the world by removing themselves from certain things, but they're also not, let's say, principally involved in elevating the existence of others, right? And for me, it's why I wanted to share some of those quotes from people like Ursula King or Karen Armstrong, because there's something about, though, that even in that introspective turn, right, you come to recognize that in my own journey to do so, I should be able to respect that you also are going through that dynamic. And as soon as I respect that and see it relationally, you may end up in a different commitment place. But we're both on that journey, and we both are trying to work through it in the ways, the skills, and the opportunities that we do have, right? It's why so much for me, spirituality is embedded in a sense of relationality, right? But there is that concern. I think we see that across the board, and I think a lot of people who do become spiritual and religious, there is an initial that I'm rejecting the institution, so now it's purely inward. And it goes back to the earlier point you made. It's why some people still will use the language of religion really profoundly when I talk to them, but will refuse to identify with the religion because to do so takes them back into an external space. And they want this to be an internal truth. But it goes back to the question. I think when you embrace it as your truth, I'm not sure how that doesn't lead into something that I also want you to have that. I want you to have that. I want you to have that, right? It's, I'll just be really honest. Like, so the other day I was in a class when teaching about spiritual awakening. I had a student actually say, got on the question of gay marriage, and they simply said, I simply don't understand it. I said, well, it's not your place to understand, but let's put it like this. Do you love someone? Yes. How do you know? I just know. Same thing, right? So that experience you have of love is what somebody else is encountering, and it may be directed towards that you don't know, but it's the same feeling, right? And spirituality to me is an attempt to try to capture some of that aspect of it.
Thank you. I know there were a couple more questions. There was one in
I didn't have any questions. I just wanted to make a comment on what you said earlier, why there is no movement from east to west rather than it's mostly here. I'm going to give you some personal experience. I moved here in the US back in the 80s. I was not religious at all. I became religious here. And part of the reason why I became religious here is because I got the freedom to explore and to look for myself, okay, this is what I want. On the other hand, I'm originally from India. When I was back in India, it was like my society, my parents, it was like, if you don't do this, we're not going to feed you. If you don't go here, to a religious place, you're a bad person. And I just felt suffocated and decided like, okay, there is a lot of pressure back there and there is no space to explore. So one of I'm grateful for that, that we have the ability to, at least in this country, have the ability to have a diversity. We may not necessarily agree, but on the other hand, I'm grateful for this country.
I appreciate you sharing that though, right? Because there is the sense that religion and spirituality can be positioned elsewhere in a very rigid, confined way, right? It is this and this alone. There is not a that, right? And so when that becomes available, that's kind of what I was trying to capture in some of those categories of spiritual and religious. So those people who are exploring, right? That, to your point, they may know in their heart of hearts the truth of a creator, the belief in a higher power, but the system they found themselves in before was so restrictive and so rigid, right, that they actually could not find a way to express it or connect to it. And in that capacity to journey, to experience new things, as I tell my students, you can walk down around our campus and you can walk into an ashram, a mosque, a synagogue, and about 13 different types of denominational churches, right? Enter in those spaces, experience it, right? That's not an opportunity that you get in all other locations, right? So I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I was really interested in the categories you showed there. And I consider myself both, like deeply religious and also deeply spiritual person because, I'm a yoga teacher, meditation coach, and also I'm a deeply religious person. But I was like, do we have an overlap here? Or are we just either or category wise?
No, I think, keep going, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I was interested in the nuns category too. Is it atheist purely that category? Because I feel it's when we start, in a hardline way, we start defining these categories, we're sometimes missing out on the essence because I identify myself a lot with more than two, there. So as a deeply religious, spiritual, meditation, yoga, like all of that embedded into one. So, and I know, and I also wanted to know, are these spaces coming out of a fear of losing the institutions based on what's happening currently with a lot of institutions dying and a lot of younger generation not wanting to identify because of the politicization of issues that are not represented in the institution?
Yeah, no, I think, to your first point, yeah, there's absolutely, if you like a Venn diagram, there's, these things are circles over each other, so there is no separation, right? There's the aspect where maybe spirituality is seen as more of an experience of a higher power, an experience of one's faith, or an experience of practices that fortify, that connect us to others, that bind us to the earth, for example, where religion might be more the context of how we understand ourselves in the world and where we come from. Right, one might be more connected to the way we deal with existential questions, right? Where did I come from? Why am I here? What is my purpose? Where do I go when I die? Where spirituality might address the practice. So yes, I think that these things are, sometimes the way I talk about in class is almost more like a wave, right? We're all part of the one ocean, we're all part of this together, but maybe those up points we can see as the spirituality when we're involved in operating, and those down points where we're settled is when we're kind of within our religious setting. So these things are not separate, and I think it goes to the earlier comment is why these are, and Bob, your question too about should we even call it spirituality, right? Because it's not easy. And I think depending on who we talk to, the religion that they come out of or the spirituality they see, these things mean very different things, right? I would say that in terms of the nuns, it's a wide open one, right? I think that the studies that stress the nuns miss the point that really all they're saying is I don't affiliate with a recognized system or institution of religion. It doesn't tell us anything, though, if they have a belief in something higher. So they often restrictively define religion as something like the Catholic Church, right? Or conservative Judaism, or Sunni Islam, right? Or a specific form of Hinduism, or Mahayana Buddhism, right? That I can find doctrines, I can find teachings, I can find edifices, I can find communities, I can find agreed upon practices, right? That has an orthodoxy, correct doctrine, orthopraxy, correct practice. And that's what I mean by religion, and I want nothing to do with that. And then you start talking, they're like, oh yeah, but totally believe in God. But what is God to you? Well, then it gets a little challenging because they don't want to use the language of religion, right? And so the nuns to me are a really important category that range between pure atheists, I'm not affiliated because I don't believe, Not only do I not believe in a higher power, I think that religious institutions are simply the constructs of humans that maybe had a good intention to bring us together, but have been used for nefarious reasons, right? It can be really negative, right? These might be the more militant atheists, people like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, for example. You have soft atheists who say, and sometimes they're called agnostics, right? I, in my heart of hearts, don't believe, but I also recognize that I can't understand everything, so I leave myself open to the possibility of it. Others who say, I'm not affiliated with a religion, and I'll say, what did you do on Sunday? Like, oh, I went to church with mom, right? But that's going to community. They don't actually see them as participating in the religious aspects of it, right? But the community. And so, you know, part of this is thinking about all that complexity and trying to whittle it down to a 40-minute talk, which makes this tough. But yeah, I think that nuns are, and who are often sometimes called the unaffiliated, I actually prefer that term, because nuns suggest that you have nothing. And that's not what you find, right? They simply, I think to your earlier point about, sometimes just want a different language, right? And for them, it's often based on some level of the religion or spiritual tradition they belong to does not align with their identity, or maybe something traumatic happened, that they can't say themselves within that place. But saying that you're a nun does not necessarily tell us anything more than that, right? And more studies are coming out that are really trying to gauge now with, like, not the quantitative data points, but the qualitative one. Okay, you answered none on the survey, but let's get into deeper, right? What do you do during the week? You know, how do you fortify? What do you belong to any rituals? Do you belong to anything? Sunday Assembly, which is a massive atheist church, for example. And these are people who are like, oh, I'm atheist, there is no God. But they will be Sunday every day in community, in church. And they use that term church because sometimes I think it's a way of not rocking the boat too much.
The one we have here is over on Lombardi.
Yeah.
Okay. Lambeau Field.
There you go.
Yes,
we're the Spartans, right? Just go to the
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
We're gonna squeeze in one more to the back here.
Okay, I got this. All right, so, oh, I'm sorry. So I don't go to church. I just believe it's a corrupt organization, just, you know. So anyway, so someone, like, how long ago was it? Anyway, he passed away. And so I decided to go to church just to see what they had to say about it. And it started off good, and we believe in Jesus, we're here, great, you know, that's what you're here for. And then he decided to talk about how you can become a martyr. And I went, what? Why, what are you dying for? You know? And then it turned to how you should follow this person now. And that's when I literally just stared at him and went, what? I thought we were here to worship Jesus. Okay. So that is when he said, well, you should follow this person, or why they follow this person. And I said, I don't know why either, because he spreads hatred. And that is when I got an elbow to the ribs and told to be quiet. And I said, get up. And he said, what? I said, get up. I'm moving. And I walked out. And I said, and I'm sorry if some people, I went home and I bawled, because I thought, if this is what a small town in Wisconsin is telling their congregation, and if so many are spreading this, what chance do we have? And if we're going to church, this is what I did. And this is the reason, and this is the direction we're supposed to follow. And we are in God's image. And this is what is being said. Then what hope do we have? And I would hope to God that people find decency and not just follow blindly, you know, to people that have bad intentions. And I don't know. I mean, I think I'm a good person, but I don't think I have to go to an establishment to be that good person. And yeah, so I do call myself, I do say God, but I do find that I'm more spiritual because I don't believe in the organization, because people are so corrupt. And there are people using his name to spread hatred. Like, you talk about the LGBTQ and, you know, this and that. It's like, if they don't fit into this little category, then they're pushed away or whatever. And I just hate that.
I appreciate you sharing, right? I truly, truly do, right? Because I think you captured the significance of what we're talking about. right? That there are many people who go into these edifices, who go into church, and they get the reaffirming message, right? That to believe in God, to accept Jesus, is not so much a validation of your identity or your salvation, but a challenge, right? To go in that world and act with service, right? That means one of Christ's most deep messages. The easiest part of faith is faith. Now go do the hard work. Go out and serve others, right? And you can find that message, but at the same time, you can find the counter message, right? You can find the willful, intentional use, misapplication, misinterpretation of religion and belief in order to fortify a certain identity marker that I would argue is often connected to making somebody feel more comfortable, because if they have that on their side, they're in that in-group, then, you know, that comfort cannot be intervened upon. And I think what you're finding are more and more people, at least the group that we study, spiritual and religious, who that is often their experience, right? That they either hear from a family member, it may be a religious authority, but it's somebody who's saying to believe is to be like this, right? That the message of Jesus is to love. Accept that person over there, right? Or accept that group over there. And especially among the young generation, because I mostly study people who are like 18 to 30, right? I do a lot with my college students. And I get that story comes out, I do sessions with students every week, we just get together and have these conversations. I'd say every time a new student comes in, they're typically telling a story like that. Some of them will counter it, but say, well, this is my experience. It's like, this is the point, right? The fact is that we have this spectrum of experiences, right? And these spectrum of experiences can fortify, they can lead to a world of compassion and empathy and altruism, right? And we can also get the exact opposite. Predicated and hidden beneath the veil, though, of love and altruism and compassion. And so at the end of every class I teach, I tell my students, I say, continue to be beautiful human beings, act always with compassion. I can't wait to see you the next class. And what I mean by beautiful human beings is that capacity to enliven the existence of another. And to me, that's the message that I got from my grandma. That's not the message I got in the synagogue, right? But I recognize those two things were contingent because my grandma was operating from her identity, right? And so we're navigating these spaces, and the encounter you had was real, right? And this is the reason why, on one hand, we need to try to recognize what people are going through, but to understand, and this is maybe the greatest challenge as a scholar, is I'm not writing about something elsewhere. I'm trying to engage with something happening right now among people in a world that is more closely together and yet as fragmented as we can possibly imagine. And behind that fragmentation is often some expression somewhere of religion and spirituality. And yet when I turn the corner and find this community group acting over here, or this food bank happening over here, or this justice movement I've been involved in, or this movement, and I start talking to people, they're often invigorated by their religion and their spirituality, but it's been detethered from the institution. And so I think that we're going to start, going back to your point, Bob, that maybe there's something more happening here. And I think it's often based on that experience and the experience we have. And in the end, I know just one truth. This is all I know for certain. You and I are here together. And if we accept that truth, how do I not celebrate your existence? Because I want that in return, reciprocity, right? But it's something that I often think can be cultivated out of us very quickly. And raising 4 kids in a digital age, trying to show them relationality, right? And trying to introduce them to practices they can build in. Well, ultimately, they're going to come across a society in which dad is telling them to love, 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 love. In the true Greek meaning of philia, love for the other because the other is there, right? But that's not something they encounter, navigating the horrors of middle school, which is just right? Or, having a friend who has to stay with us because he can't stay in his own house because of his identity, because his parents have barred him, right? Is that an indictment of the religion? Is an indictment of the parent? I don't necessarily always know, right? But if we ignore this, then we ignore both the beauty that can emerge and the real compassion, the real love, but also the ability to simply start cleaving apart, right, communities. So thank you for sharing.
Morgan, thank you. say I envy your students, because at the end of a class, you can always say, I'll see you Thursday. And we're just gonna have to bring you back. So thank you very much.
I'm the only Morgan Shipley at MSU. Feel free to email me though. I'm happy to carry on conversations.
Thanks so much.